Part 3 of this desk build actually started way back in part 1 when I cut the legs. The cutoffs from those legs will become the corners of the upper cabinet, so that's where we'll start today. The construction of the upper cabinet is going to be a little bit different from the bottom. I'll be using more solid wood, but the stock I have for these parts isn't exactly in an ideal state. I'm going to do what I can to get it as flat as I can, but I'll also lose quite a bit of thickness getting there. Behind me here you can see those 4 legs and how they continue up to the top cabinet. I have them just set on the bottom cabinets to make sure that I size everything to match the bottom exactly. This piece may have been the worst one of all, so I'm using it for some smaller pieces where I can still get some decent flatness over a smaller distance. Once I got them milled down and flat, I cut all my joinery with my slot mortiser. I had a few pieces that pushed the limits of the mortiser, but this was not the biggest at all. Now this is where I did things a little bit different from the bottom cabinets. This is a piece of cherry plywood that I'm going to use for a few key pieces of the top. The first is the bottom panel of the cabinet. I went with a commercial cherry plywood rather than shop sawn veneer for a couple reasons. First, the bottom will only ever be seen if you get down on the floor and look up at a small part of the desk. Second, I was running a little low on stock that was thick enough and flat enough to make veneers. So I decided it was a much better use of time and materials to go the easy route here and save my stock for other more important parts. This is the point where I really tested the capacity of my mortiser, and I think this may have been a little bit beyond the limits of what I should be using it for. This looks a little sketchy, but I made it work somehow. There's going to be a couple slide out trays on each side, and the parts I'm cutting here are for a web frame that sits above those trays and acts sort of as a bottom for the space for the drawers. It has to get attached at a height just slightly higher than the thickness of the trays, and also has to be notched to fit around those corner leg pieces. Once I had the joinery marked out, I needed to get the dry fit broken back down. The front and back of the cabinet need mortises cut at the top of the front rail and kind of right in the middle of the back panel. I have a jig I can use the mortiser to hold the pieces flat to cut those. Here you can see how this web frame will create the space for the slide out trays. There's just over 3/4 of an inch between the bottom and the web frame. You can also see how one entire side of that cherry plywood will be hidden forever once this desk is glued up. And speaking of the trays, before I move on to other things, I'll get them cut to rough size. It's funny, as I'm watching this now, I can see my snowblower in the background. In a few minutes, you're going to see me wearing shorts in these videos. The weather in Illinois is a little unpredictable, but it is not that bad. For reasons I might get into in another video, my time to be out here is starting to be a little bit limited at this point. It's the reason why there was such a gap in between parts 1 and 2. It took me over a year in total to build this desk. Like most of you, I'm a hobbyist. and I build in my spare time. Sometimes that spare time is just a little bit more infrequent than I would like. This is the front top rail, and it will be dovetailed into place just like the top rails and the two bottom cabinets were. I'm following the same process basically I did with those rails. I cut the dovetails with a jig at the bandsaw, then clean them up with a chisel. I'll use a knife to mark them on the corner leg pieces, and then remove whatever waste I can at the drill press. After that, I finish removing the waste and fine-tuning the fit with a chisel. These panels and the smaller supports I'm making will make up the top half of the upper cabinet. The panels are part of a subtop that will go above the drawers, and these smaller pieces create a center channel where the hardware for holding up the top will mount. Each gets hardwood edging, but for these smaller center pieces I made it pretty thick since it'll be a show service on the front of the desk. Once they were trimmed to slide perfectly into place between the web frame and the top rail, I just have to trim them to length. Then I could start laying out the joinery for another round of cutting mortises on my mortiser. They each need mortises on the top and bottom edge, and in the middle facing each other. With the two middle dividers in place, I can move on and I can measure and cut the two top panels to their final size and get that joinery cut as well. These mortises on the bottom of the top panel were another point where I was testing, or I don't know, maybe proving out the capacity of this mortiser. As long as the mortises aren't too far from the edge, it wasn't too bad working with a panel this size, but any bigger would have been a little bit too much. Anyway, with the rest of the joinery cut, I can move on and get the web frame glued up. The central divider can also get glued up after a little bit of sanding. A few pieces need some final touches and chamfers cut on them, and then I can start with the case assembly. I'll work in sub-assemblies and get the outer panels glued up first, but all of the internal surfaces will either have drawers or the side trays sliding against them eventually, so they'll need to be sanded down and waxed. The technique I'm using here is to rub the pieces down with a bar of paraffin wax. Once everything is coated, I keep a small dedicated iron in the shop that I use just for this, and I use it to melt the wax into the grain of the wood. That way it creates a durable and smooth surface where the drawers can slide for a long time. This wax done this way really lasts. The bottom panel where the pull-out trays will slide also gets a coat of wax. This surface in particular will have a wide area of direct contact when you slide those trays in and out, and will be very difficult to get to once everything gets assembled. For the glue up of the case, I'm using epoxy, mostly for its open time. There are a lot of tenons to glue in and align, and several large sub-assemblies all coming together at once. The long open time of epoxy gave me all the time I needed to get everything in place and clamp down without having to stress about how long it was going to take. Off camera, I also milled down a couple pieces of stock to fill in the gaps behind the legs and the sides. These are so that the drawers will have a continuous surface to write against, and I'll have to do the same thing on the lower cabinets as well. The top rail wasn't quite ready for glue up. I still needed to cut a dado in it for the piano hinge that will attach to the top. This was a little awkward to cut because of its size and placement compared to the top rail. I probably could have cut it at the router table if with the right fence setup, but I decided to just cut it by hand with a chisel and a router plane. This took a little bit of time, but it worked well. I started by marking everything out with a knife and with a marking knife, and then I started at one end with a chisel, making small cuts all the way down. I cleaned that up with a router plane. I just had to be careful to keep it flat, which was a little hard with as little surface areas I had to register it on. I had to butt up another piece behind it to give myself a little bit more area that I could keep pressure on just to keep it flat. This part of the glue up was pretty tricky. There was joinery that had to come together in multiple directions at once. Those drawer sides that I glued in earlier will act as alignment and registration for the sides of these panels where I couldn't add any tenons. The panels have to get inserted into the back tenons first, and then the front rail gets added on, and then both sides and the front rail can be brought down into the joinery that's underneath of them. A few dozen clamps later, and we're all set. You can see by the unglued top behind me here that I'm showing this a little out of order of how I actually built it, but I'm going to keep going with the slide out trays now. The trays will be hidden behind what looks like a piece of trim that flows around the desk from the front, but I also need to get some hardwood edging on the front and back of those trays since those parts will be visible when the trays are pulled out. Once those are on, I can cut the panels to their final size. Those end pieces need a large rabbet cut so that they can sit at the right depth when the panel's actually closed or when the trays are closed. That was easy to do with the table saw here. They both need a little bit of cleanup at the bench to clean up the saw marks and to create some nice crisp corners. I used the table saw to flush up the ends, but because they extended both above and below the plywood, and the trays were a little bit too wide for my sled for it to be laying down, I had to stand the trays upright with a spacer behind them. Once they were clamped in place, they were pretty solid like that. I'm adding these wedges on the trays, which when the tray is pulled out will both act as stops and slightly wedge under the web frame to stabilize the trays. I'll have to take them back off, of course, and then reinstall them in the cabinet after final assembly. So moving on to the top, you can really get an appreciation for the state of this wood while I get it milled. It's pretty rough, but the pieces I had set aside for the top were just so full of character that it made it worth it in the end. It took a while to get everything straight and flat, but there was still plenty of thickness left once I did, and you can start to get an appreciation for just what this is going to look like. I also filled all the holes and cracks with epoxy off camera too. I used biscuits to keep everything aligned during the glue up, and that went pretty smoothly. I didn't get the squeeze out scraped off before it fully dried, so the next day I had to use a combination of a chisel and a card scraper to get the joints cleaned up. This desktop is going to be basically unsupported. It'll be attached to the piano hinge at the front and then just to a single point of the tilt hardware kind of in its middle. So I'll be adding breadboard ends to make sure that it always stays flat for a long time to come. After getting it cut to size, I mark everything out and use a router to remove the bulk of the waste. I took small passes and had a fence set to the final depth. The last pass created a nice crisp edge. Front also needed a dado cut for the piano hinge, which I cut pretty easily with a dado stack at the table saw. The desktop will have a shoulder that runs most of the width of the breadboard ends and then longer tenons. I'm starting by cutting the recess for just that shoulder, which I can then use to adjust the thickness of the tenon with hand planes. Once I'm happy with the fit, I can mark out and cut the tenons and the mortises on the ends. There we go. I'm going to be installing the dowels on the breadboard ends in pretty much the traditional way. I drill the breadboard ends at the drill press, bring them back to the top and mark with a brad point bit, then drill the holes in the tenons just a hair inboard. I'm not showing it here, but I also elongated the outer sets of holes to allow movement. I'm adding just a touch of glue on the center tenon, but none on any of the others. Then after I hammer on the breadboard end, I'll drive in the first dowel in the center hole. You can see when I do that the dowel is at a little bit of an angle until it gets through the bottom hole, and as it does, it straightens out and it pulls that breadboard end in tight. The other dowels go in with no glue until just the last 1/4 inch. The last major pieces to build are the drawers. I'm starting with the drawer fronts, which I'll be making from this one piece of cherry that I've cut into a couple book matches. When I opened it up, I saw a couple of spots that were a little soft and needed to be stabilized with some penetrating epoxy before I could actually use them. Once that had cured, I worked on getting them sized to the drawer openings. Between these two pieces, I hope to get 2 sets of drawer fronts that are book matched top to bottom. Took a little back and forth, first with the table saw, and then after that with hand planes to get them to fit the way I wanted. But I got there eventually. Before I could start on the drawer boxes, I had to add the runners behind the legs like I did on the top. With those in place, I'll be able to properly test and tune the drawer fit once I get the boxes built. All the drawers are going to be dovetailed on this desk, and I always like to start by adding a small rabbet under the mating edge of the sides. Those rabbets create a nice sharp shoulder on the inside of the drawer once they're glued up. It avoids any possibility of having any gaps visible in the joinery when you look inside the drawer. When I bought this wood, the lady selling it thought that it was all cherry, but it turned out that there were a few pieces of white oak mixed in that her late husband must have milled up at the same time. I decided to use that for the drawer sides and backs. I thought it created a nice contrast and allowed me to carry that backstory of the lumber through to even more parts of the desk. I decided to use the blue tape trick to mark out the pins for this one. I go back and forth between just marking the wood directly and using this trick. It's a great method and it leads to great results. Sometimes I'm not quite sure it's worth that little bit of extra hassle, but it doesn't hurt, that's for sure. I made this board that's under my drawer side when I made my moccasin vise. It locks into my wagon vise, and I covered it with some leftover cork rubber. I use it for cleaning up my dovetails and other kind of light chiseling that I'm doing. It keeps the pieces I'm working on in place and overall makes a great surface to work on. I'm not even sure where the idea came from, but I love having it around. The dovetails on the drawer fronts are going to be half blind. I'm using the same method I used earlier of hogging out the waste of the drill press and then cleaning everything up with a chisel. This is my favorite way to cut half blind dovetails. I don't mind the extra work with the chisel, it's kind of my happy place. You can also see here that same board I was using earlier fits in the moccasin vise as well. That way I can use it as a backer when I'm paring away the sides and I don't have to worry about breaking out the material on the front of the drawer face. This desk is pretty deep, and rather than making like really long drawers or having some empty space behind them, I decided to build a second hidden set of drawers to fill that space. They'll sit behind the regular drawers, and this cutout will allow you to reach inside the desk and grab them without having any kind of pull on the front of those back hidden drawers. This bit I'm using here has both top and bottom bearings, and so rather than risk having any kind of tear out, which has happened to me on a router before going uphill against the grain like this on the ends, I decided that I'd flip each piece over, raise or lower that bit so that I can always be going downhill there. I'm pre-drilling and running in steel screws for these drawer pulls. I'll use brass screws in the final assembly, so I wanted to make sure that the threads were all pre-cut before then. With that taken care of, the last thing the drawers will need is the bottoms cut to size. The very last thing to take care of is the hardware to actually mount the top to the bottom. There are two wood rails that will align the top and the bottom on each side, and then I'll install threaded inserts into the top to bolt everything together.
First question, have you been out here to peek at all? Like this
Not
week?
today.
This week?
I've seen bits and pieces because you were out here the one time I looked.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So yes, I've peeked a couple times. You excited?
Alright.
Your who's under? Oh. Oh. Oh my goodness. Okay. How does everything work?
Alright. And you can lift it up. In order to put it back down, you go all the way up. Up and down. But they're all meant so you can reach in and just grab them if you need to. So when you look at it, you're going to see a lot of, like, there's all these knots, right?
Yeah.
Did I tell you where all this wood came from? I think.
Your insignia almost made me cry.
Thank you.
So I know it took me a little while to get this video out, but I'm already working on my next build, and there will be more videos, maybe at a slightly slower pace. But thank you for watching, and I hope I will see you on the next one.